Earlier, we spoke to two members of the U.S. House of Representatives Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party, Congressman Raja Krishnamoorthi, a Democrat, and Congressman Darren LaHood, a Republican, both from the state of Illinois. They're visiting the UK for meetings with their counterparts here, and we spoke about their work on the China Committee.
I think that this is exactly what we need to make sure that not only our dollars, but also potential technical expertise and know-how don't get into the wrong hands. What I mean by that is that we have investigated some of these firms, and what we've found is that they are invested in state-owned enterprises or other companies in China that unfortunately are affiliated with CCP entities that are developing hypersonic missile programs. They're developing their nuclear programs. They're helping with developing facial recognition and AI software to repress the Uyghurs. So we don't want to be invested in those types of programs that harm our interests or our values.
So, Congressman LaHood, what Congressman Krishnamoorthi has just been saying is essentially that U.S. dollars have been until now also funding the development of Chinese military interests?
That's correct. One thing the committee has been focused on is how do we counteract China? And China continues to abide by a different set of rules and standards that every other industrialized country in the world does. And in many ways, they can't be trusted by their actions that they have taken, whether it's in AI, whether it's in facial recognition, whether it's the repression of Uyghurs. I think it came to a head when we saw the balloon fly over the U.S. Several months ago. Their blatant support for Ukraine, their wolf warrior diplomacy they continued to exhibit around the globe. And so those things have caused us to look at how do we change the narrative here. And I think the direction the Biden administration is taking is a step forward. We got to continue to put the pressure on them.
What would that look like, continuing to put on the pressure?
Well, listen, I think we have to come to the realization China has a plan to replace the United States, and they're working at it every single day. And I don't say that to scare people, but they want to beat us technologically, militarily, economically, and diplomatically. And so we have to focus on how do we win that strategic competition. And so how you do that is, I think it's going to be one on the economic front and figuring out how do we partner with our like-minded allies in the Indo-Pacific region, be more engaged there from the economic standpoint to work with them to, again, so that they're not so, emboldened to side with China on things. They feel like they're trapped, many of the countries in the Indo-Pacific region between China and us. We have to exert more leadership over there. Frankly, I don't think this administration has done enough of that.
Congressman Krishnamoorthi, if you listen to the messaging from Beijing, China has said that the U.S. or accused the U.S. of trying to suppress its economic rise. Are you worried about some sort of reaction from China, particularly on this executive order?
No, I'm not concerned. Look, I think that our quarrel is not with the Chinese people. We don't seek to contain or suppress their legitimate economic aspirations. However, where they engage in cyber theft or hacks that involve planting malware in our critical infrastructure in the United States, where they, engage in practices and aggression, especially military aggression against Taiwan or in the South China Sea or against even India and the Himalayas. The point is that is not the type of behavior that's consistent with the international rules-based order. Where we have differences, let's resolve them peacefully, and let's play by rules that make sense. Finally, I would just say the Chinese economy is sliding right now. Their youth unemployment rate is 22%. Their real estate market is tanking. They're on the verge of deflation, and their number one export in the world right now is high net worth individuals, people who are fleeing the country because of the arbitrariness of their laws. And so this is not a time for them to engage in retaliatory measures or any types of other measures that could curb their prosperity.
As we're here in London, I want to ask you about U.S.-UK relations as well, because in June, the Prime Minister and the President met in Washington and announced an Atlantic declaration to counter Russia and China, and included closer partnership in defense, in nuclear energy, critical metals for energy as well. But just this week, HSBC Bank's head of public affairs accused the British government of being, quote, weak for complying with U.S. demands to cut back business dealings with China. Now, he has since apologized for that, but are the U.S. and the U.K., Congressman LaHood, aligned on China?
Well, I think they are. Part of our conversations this week with our UK counterparts is to, make sure they are firm on that, because I think we have to take a strong stance. And Obviously, the partnership with the UK extends for a long period of time. We work well together, both from a national security standpoint, from an intelligence standpoint, from an economic standpoint. Our countries have never been stronger than they are today. But, this is a challenge when it comes to China. I think what the CCP fears the most is bipartisan support in the Congress against them, but also working with our like-minded allies. And that starts with the UK. We don't have a stronger ally than the UK. And so, again, we're reaffirming that what our select committee is doing in Washington, D.C. with our UK counterparts this week.
Have you found that as well in your conversations?
I have. I think that the UK is forward-leaning with regard to its posture relative to the Chinese Communist Party. That being said, I think that we can continue to strengthen our multilateral pressure. Now, what do I mean by that? We are adopting outbound restrictions right now with regard to investments from the United States into the People's Republic of China. We'd like to see the same in the UK. Also, with regard to the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which has been adopted by the U.S. Congress on a bipartisan basis to prevent slave labor and forced labor by the Uyghurs from tainting our supply chains, we'd like to see the UK adopt a similar measure prohibiting the import of those types of products. The more that we act multilaterally, the less that Xi Jinping can play us off against each other. And so that is the attitude I hope that we can collectively take.
Okay, I have one more question for you both on U.S.-UK relations. The question of a possible trade deal between these two countries has come up in the past. At the moment, it does look like a distant possibility, but the shadow trade secretary here in the UK, Nick Thomas-Symonds, told The Guardian that Labour, the Labour Party's ideological closeness to the Democrats, puts the party in an ideal position to sign trade deals with the U.S. should both parties win their elections next year. So I have to ask you first, Congressman LaHood, a Republican, what do you think of that?
Well, I serve on the Ways and Means Committee, which has jurisdiction over trade. I serve on the Trade Subcommittee. If you look at what we did in USMCA about 3 years ago, where we did a trade agreement with Mexico and Canada, bipartisan agreement, had broad support in the Congress, and it's working fairly well right now. If you look at those 28 chapters, we ought to be able to plug in the UK on there. It makes complete sense to do that. And there have been differences in the past as it relates to agriculture here in the UK. We've talked to our colleagues here about that. From my perspective, there's no reason why we shouldn't have a free trade agreement with the UK.
And yours?
I agree. I think that it makes all the sense in the world to have a free trade pact so long as we maintain sufficient environmental, labor, and other standards. And we recognize that, our food is just as good as anyone else's from the United States and should be treated as such around the world.
Congressman, thank you both very much for joining us.